Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded by me, Liam Miller, he, him, his, on the unceded lands of the Gayo-Muggle people. My guest today is Sally Douglas. Sally, welcome along.
Hi Liam, it's lovely to be here.
Now, for those who don't know, real fans of the podcast know that I interviewed Sally before there was a podcast, back when it was just the burgeoning YouTube channel connected to the chaplaincy ministry. But we got you on a real proper, canonical episode now, which is exciting. But so for those who don't know, Sally is a Uniting Church minister who works in the mode of scholar pastor. She ministers with an inner city parish, lectures at Pilgrim Theological College, and is an honorary research associate with the University of Divinity. Her interdisciplinary doctoral research spanning biblical studies and theology was completed through the United Faculty of Theology in Melbourne and published to critical acclaim as Early Church Understandings of Jesus as the Female Divine, the Scandal of Particularity, which was published with T&T Clark Bloomsbury in 2016. Her book that we are discussing today is The Church The Church as Salt, Becoming the Community Jesus Speaks About, which is published through Coventry Press and has just come out and has, the camera's a bit blurry, but has a wonderful drawing on the front. And we'll talk about it more later, wonderful drawings throughout. So Sally, where's this book emerged from for you? Was this, this idea of the church as salt, something you've been playing around for a while? Did it come more recently? So I guess, where does the idea come from, and what are you hoping by turning it into this book and sending it out into the world?
Good questions. I think the bigger question that was central for me was a kind of a really strong pastoral concern for people who were trying to make sense of the world that we're in right now. And so wanting to help people to have access to bigger questions and a bigger framework for thinking about the church now in terms of the biblical text, but also I think the early church and early church writers can really be informative as we try to make sense of where we are, because there's a really common narrative, which is in the media, which is replayed in churches all over the place, across denominations, that the church is dying, the church is in decline, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's a really faulty assumption and claim. And in the book, that's what I really wanted to address. And it was helpful to come back to some of the metaphors that Jesus uses. And when I first began, I thought that we'd probably spend time exploring various metaphors that Jesus used in the gospel. So, become like a mustard seed and become like a child. They're all quite little things. But as I engaged more and more deeply with the imagery of salt, I realized it was so rich. I just needed to stay with that one particular metaphor. So it was really, I actually loved working on it. I hadn't planned to write this book. I was in the middle of working on some other things, but I was approached to think about it, and then it all just unfolded, and it was a delight to do. So
great. And I'm glad you did, because I think it's a really helpful book. And I was reading through it, just been like, I'm about to start a new placement, and I was like, this would be something handy to do, because it's got reflection questions and practices built in at the end of each chapter. And I'm like, this would be a good conversation, because I think particularly, it addresses, as you say, right at the heart of that. You go into so many churches still, and you particularly thinking of uniting churches, which is, you're my context directly. And it's still so much of that. Oh, if you were here 5 decades ago, or what have you, like 400 kids in the Sunday school and we had all these things, we had the choir, and we were able to do so much of that and bless so many people through it. And so much happened, and, and you go, well, and then the logic is, well, since that's not there, what is happening now is a problem.
Correct.
Right? Is a diminishment, is not that, it's worse. And I think part of the struggle now is that question of, is the idea to get back there, or at least some sort of modern conception of that, or is it something else? And I guess the big part of this book is not dying, but being refined.
That's right. Yeah. And to interrogate some of the assumptions around that reminiscence about the church of a relatively recent past, 5 decades ago or more, that sense that let's look at it contextually. So there was a particular period in history after 2 world wars, and so I suspect for some people there was a longing for meaning and purpose and seeking the divine. But alongside that, there was also an absolute cultural expectation that if you were a good citizen, you attended worship. So if you wanted to be seen as an upstanding businessman, you needed to, whether it was whatever denomination, didn't matter, but you needed to be attending. If you wanted to be seen as an upright woman and contribute to the society, you needed to be a churchgoer. And so there's a cultural expectation of that. And then alongside that, there's a lot of people not that wealthy, and not that much on offer to do on weekends. And so the church is the social hub for the dance or the tennis club or the theatre group or whatever it is, was critical, because there wasn't as much on offer, and it was the place where you not only gained respectability, but you might meet your future partner, and it was where you went to social activities. There was a huge amount that swirled around it, and none of that is necessarily wrong, but that's not what Jesus talks about at all in Be the Church. Jesus didn't say be the church and be the purveyor of respectability. Like Jesus had the Gospels tell us over and over again that Jesus had a reputation for being really suspect in his choices about who he spent time with, that he had a reputation for being a glutton and a drunkard, that he had a reputation for hanging out with who everyone else saw as the lowlives. I think we're a bit prim about it when we call them the sinners. Like, I think using language that, the same kind of disrespectful language that's thrown around now, that's how people would, the no-hopers, the those who are, the bludgers, those who are considered to be making dodgy choices. And the religious elite in Jesus' day are like, seriously, show us a sign. How can you be the God one? Because you're hanging out with all of these people. And it's just so ironic that the church became embroiled in this notion of respectability, because it's the opposite of how we're told Jesus is in the Gospels. And so what's really interesting about this period in time, I think, is not that there's been less people attending worship, because in terms of societal expectations, at least in Australia, if you say that you're a Christian, you're not going to garner respect. Most likely you're going to have the mickey taken out of you, disrespect, distrust, and so on. So the exact context has entirely flipped around. And then alongside that, there are heaps of places to go for entertainment that are affordable. There are heaps of places to meet a partner. You're not going to be respected for your business if you go to church. So all of those things have entirely changed, turned 180. What I find much more interesting is that people still go to church.
Yes.
No kudos involved, and a whole lot of other things on offer to do, and yet people, young and old, are still going. And I would argue perhaps even there are more people attending worship now. And what I mean by that is they're not there for all those other reasons. They're much more likely to be there because they might articulate it in different ways or struggle to articulate it, but a sense of wanting to know more about Jesus, wanting to follow in this expression of spirituality, seeking God.
I'm curious, as it comes out a bit in the book, and I'm thinking about this what you've just been saying here, how much that is born of your experience at Richmond United, and I guess particularly as from the sounds of it, now I'm doing ministry with a lot of folks who have no memory or nostalgic attachment to that era of church, right? Who are not there because of anything like that. A lot not there because of any, some, yes, it's an inherited faith and they're wrestling with it, but also those who there's none. And so I'm curious then about how also this project, in a sense of go, okay, let's think about it again from ground up, essentially. Is this helpful thing of in your own ministry context, of helping people understand what is this thing that you now find yourself a part of, strangely drawn to, connected to, but on the how have you found it as a kind of a helpful way of thinking and forming a community, in a totally new time?
I think so. I think we need to be really in an ongoing way, not in a aggressive way, but a gentle way, but in an ongoing way, questioning ourselves if we're involved, whether lay or ordained, if we're in faith communities. What are we here for? What are we doing? Why are we doing it? and coming back to those questions again and again. And so I talk about it in the book. So each year at Richmond, we have this, we call it pizza dreaming, where we have pizzas and we reflect together on how the year has been. But the questions are not, do I like it? Am I happy? Like that, that kind of self-serving, which is like a survey for, other organizations, community groups you might be part of. It's like, these are our core goals, and it's to create space for authentic, transformative worship, and to create space for people to engage with and wrestle with the way of Jesus and, the biblical text and theology, and then to seek to serve in our local and global village. So that's what we hold up and go, how have we done that this year? What makes it hard? And what might we do differently? That kind of, so that we're really quite clear about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so things became, people were able to articulate more and more time, including me, what was helpful and what wasn't. And so some of those things, for example, like I explain, so we're really careful about language, and that this is something I'm really passionate about. So we don't call the prayers of confession, for example, the prayers of confession, because that is really loaded language, and people have experienced the church, often it's not in a good way. So that's the other thing about our current context, is that if people have had any kind of connection with the church, whether it's a church school or Sunday school or RA teacher, often it's not positive. Sometimes it is, but often people who come to Richmond have had no church background, or they've had traumatic church background, not always, but often. So each week I explain, we're going to have this time of prayer. It's called, in lots of places, the prayer of confession. We call it the prayers of letting go, because in the Greek of the New Testament, the word for forgive, apheo, it means let go or release. And it's the same word that you would use for the release of a captive. This is not a guilt trip. This is about all of us just being able to be honest with God about what holding us grace, to let God a bit more, to be freed a bit more. And by explaining that, it's giving people access in, if they've just walked in the first time, like, what am I being asked to do? And also we begin every single week saying, you're welcome here, whether you're full of faith or full of doubt or a mixture of the two. Please participate as much or as little as you feel able. Just so simple, but yet again, just letting people know, we're aware that this is an unusual way of being in community. Like, church is weird. Religious faith isn't just, or doesn't make sense naturally, but we're not expecting that you get it or that you agree with it because you've walked in the door. This is a space where we're going to be open and explicit about our faith, but we're not expecting you to take it on wholesale, or that you're on the same page today, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I think that is helpful, of, because that broader work of both uncoupling from particular, past experiences and a cultural captivity, and also, just acknowledging that, we're going in without a large amount of pre-existing knowledge, and so things need to be talked about, explained. We need to wade into things more, and you can do that without feeling like you're constantly robbing any kind of mystery or strangeness of what we're there to do, but you can still do so in a way that is not keeping people at arm's length.
Exactly. Yeah.
So in the kind of the first, or after the introduction, the kind of first chapter, you're kind of talking a bit about Justin Martyr. So you're kind of talking about the, very earliest non-biblical kind of extended account we have of. Oh, I see how excited you are already. I'm glad I love
Justin. Yeah.
So you kind of talk about Justin when he's talking about what Christians do and how they gather and what that kind of is as this kind of apology for the reputation they've garnered. So what does that kind of, going back to Justin Martyr, who sets the table of what it is Christians do when they come together, how does that help, I guess, shape what it is you're doing here and shape what we need to be doing in our own time?
Great question. So I loved starting with Justin because he is so early, and he's funny. Like, I think he's a great person to read. And so his background is that he was seeking philosophical, like a path to follow, and he followed, by his own account, follows various different philosophers and different schools, and then eventually becomes a Christian as an adult. And so he's a great voice in it, and he's eloquent and interesting. And what I love about him, so he's martyred in probably the 160s. So he's writing early, like who knows when John was written. Some people think maybe the 120s. So, this is, he's an early writer. And at the time, so we're not talking about that kind of state persecution on the, that massive scale. But if we can just imagine for a moment, in all the different towns, there are various temples to different Greco-Roman gods. And the expectation, now whether people fully believed it or not, we don't know, but the expectation is that everyone goes and makes sacrifices to the various gods, to get the good crop, to win the war, to have peace, to have a son, all the different things. And Christians who were seen as, it was becoming increasingly clear that they weren't just these strange Jewish people who had some exemptions, they were this other new group, and they would not do the offerings. They were seen as, they were called atheists because they wouldn't acknowledge all these other gods. And so for some, at least, there was a very real fear that they were going to bring the anger of the gods onto the local towns and bring catastrophe. And well, not everyone might have agreed with that. It was certainly good politically expedient as well to blame the Christians for, see, they didn't do the sacrifices. And so Justin writes about that really amusing, like, quoting some people going, why didn't he go and die already? Like he's like really angry at these Christ ones, these Christians. And I think it's so helpful for us because in the West, at least, from kind of the 300s and 400s onwards, increasingly the church and the state have been so entwined so that an expectation, the church has tragically, in many parts, in many denominations, assume that we should have the respect of the state and the state should listen to us. There should be special exemptions or whatever. It's not Justin's worldview at all. Like he's writing to the emperor, whether he ever thinks the emperor's going to receive his letter or not, saying, can you just stop hassling us? We're not cannibals. We're not as terrible as we've been made out to be. This is how we gather for worship and so on. So that notion that as Christians, we should have the respect of the state is a really flawed note, particularly when the one that we follow is killed by the state. I mean, it's a really curious habit of seeing ourselves that we're falling into. And I think it's so helpful for us to get free of that. I think part of it maybe is that we've somehow confused the call to love neighbour with being loved by neighbour. They don't go together necessarily. Like we're called to embody compassion and, non-judgment, etc. But there's no guarantee that they're going to like or respect or love us. And that doesn't mean we've failed in faithfulness. It is what it is. Yeah. So I think that's one of what I really wanted to start with, Justin, just to help us to get uncoupled from that particular assumption about, that notion of the church in the center of the town's square. And the purveyor of wisdom or justice for everybody else. That's not Justin's view. Like they're on the edges, trying not to get
that is helpful. I think that sets it up well, for them where you're going. So as you said, Ellie, it was interesting. You said that you were originally thinking going to have to bring in a few metaphors to get to the end of this book, and then salt ends up being rather versatile. And it's not until toward the end that you even get to salt as seasoning, right? Like the one that people might think most first association is salt goes to seasoning. First, salt goes to tears, which I think is very helpful. I think worth talking about, particularly given our current context. So we were kind of talking before we started recording that this is one of the first books that I've been reading where like COVID is an explicit character in the book, right? Like this is written. Lockdown is an explicit reality, and you're talking both about in lockdown and what we're going to need to think about coming out of it. And I think, one thing that people have talked about is, there is going to be there is needed now and will need to be ongoing, some level of acknowledgement of the grief, the trauma, the disruption, the pain, the isolation that and myriad of other things that have happened in this time. To individuals, but to the collective, right? To the whole society. Is obviously nothing comes down equally, but it's certainly so pervasive that we need to be thinking about how we do cry together, right? How we do lament and how we
Exactly.
do opening. And you kind of talk in the book that, church has not always been the best for that, even though we have resources within the faith, even though we have resources in the tradition of the liturgy and stuff, it's there. So talk to us a bit about salty tears, and particularly, I guess, thinking about, this particular season, and there's going to be this, I can feel already, this, when we come back together, it's going to be so joyous. We're back, we're here, like, and that's there. Like, I get that, but that's not all it's going to be, or at least that's, that can be the first, or that can be part of it. But if we feel like that then is all of it, and now we can just get back to doing what we do, that's probably a bit of an issue.
I agree entirely. And actually, I think this is a really important focus, and it invites leaders, lay and ordained, in faith communities to actually do some really hard and vulnerable work, because to take seriously the place of tears, and I engage with, the Psalms of lament and the reality that Jesus is recorded weeping and reflections in Revelation and so on. Tears are central to our faith, and that amazing stuff in Romans, Paul saying, weep with those who weep. It's not grab the tissue, stop them crying, or cheer them up, or tell them, don't worry, every cloud has a silver lining. And I think this is another really amazing moment for the church, as hard as it is, to get free from the really strong word, but I think vile theology that is peddled both in the church, and now I increasingly realize it's in secular quasi-spiritual worlds, about all of the awful things, everything happens for a reason, what doesn't kill you make you stronger, all the kind of greeting card vile phrases which really cause harm, like phenomenal harm to people who are already in suffering, and it's not the gospel. Like, that's the point. And so, like, we have faith in this astonishing tradition that claims that somehow we glimpse divine reality in Jesus, and that this God one chooses to enter into the muck, like the mess of our lives. So, yes, the joy, yes, the parties, and obviously there's been a lot of parties if he's getting accused of being a glutton and a drunkard, but also the sorrow and the deep pain, and doesn't try and cheer people up, but enters into that and bears witness to that. I love that with Mary and Martha, Lazarus has died. Jesus doesn't turn around and say, it's all right, I'm about to raise him. If anyone could say there's a silver lining here, Jesus could at that point, and he doesn't, he weeps. And so to take seriously that this is who and how God is, this is the God who weeps with us when we weep, like weeps, not just watches, but weeps with us when we weep. And so to be able to be the kind of people of faith who are not using faith as the opium of the masses, who are not using it as the drug just to try and block out pain, but instead who are being held by this God who weeps with us and then helps us to weep. And so that we can be in solidarity with those we journey with, not seeing them as problems to solve, because that's what, unfortunately, part of that kind of whole every cloud has a silver lining. It's this desire to make people better or fix people, rather than just journey, rather than journey with people, whether they get better or not, whether they're happy or not, and for them to know that we will weep with them, not overshadowing their tears, but be in solidarity with them. And again tomorrow, if they're still crying, that it's not like this time limit. Okay, you've had your tears, now be joyful. And it's such a shame, because there are such amazing, those prayers in the Psalms are there, like they're so faithful, but they're full on. Like, how often do we pray, seriously, God, I've drenched my pillow in tears, where are you? Like, how much of a gift would that be in our communities now, and going out of lockdown, to be able to create some spaces for that, not to valorize grief, not to be voyeuristic about grief, but to create spaces for there is joy and there is sorrow.
And I think it's so important, like, I think, it's always hard to say something like this, but like there maybe is an increasing awareness of the complexity and depth of the world's woe and the world's problems, right? Like, now folks on the margins probably aren't learning this. This is a new knowledge, but but there's this constant, we see the rhetoric around, people need to educate themselves on the the history and the present of the country, on the and just because of the nature of news and social media, you hear more stories and you come across more things about the depths of corruption or the depths of how hard it is to navigate social services, and this can both be a bombarding thing sometimes, but there's this sense of, if we're constantly trying to quieten the weeping or keep it, yes, you can weep about this thing, but once that's done, I don't want to hear about the next 7 problems because we've done that, then really we're not going to be able to actually look honestly at the world that we're in, that for good reason makes people cry, for good reason leads to such hurt and degradation, and if we're not if we're not opening up those spaces, if we're not creating a community where people can be honest about that, then we're not really going to know our neighbors in any kind of true way in order to actually love them well. So I think I think that's such an important thing of not only in this not only out of COVID, just out of this whole the time that we're in, feels so vital to actually be able to be honest, which I think Christians are meant to be able to look honestly at the world, and that's from there our hope begins, but it doesn't start earlier than that.
And it's really quite a radical stance. The impacts of social media, like I think in often cases, not always, but some of those impacts are devastating. The more and more findings they're finding about, for example, young girls' body image after the introduction of smartphones and so on. But there is so much pressure for every age group, if they're engaging with social media, to hashtag be living my best life all of the time, to be presenting a particular image of your life as successful and likable, and so much of people's sense of self-worth is now really linked to, well, how many likes did I have, or so on. And so to be able to offer a genuine space where people can have, celebrate with others, the awesome thing, but also weep as well, like the fullness, that there's something prophetic about that. Not only is it grounded in sacred text and in the person of Jesus, but it continues to be, I think, maybe even more prophetic actually now in this particular cultural moment. Yeah,
thank you. So the next kind of, we're not going to go through all the chapters, but I don't want to go to this one because I guess I was excited to see salty wombs come up next, which because we've talked in the past, we've talked about your work on Jesus as the female divine and early church literature on connecting Jesus and woman wisdom and this kind of thing. So to then be able to kind of to see that familiar aspect of your work coming through in a new kind of focus here, of thinking about the church in this kind of way and connecting to Jesus in this way. I'm curious, like, maybe first off, was this a harder chapter to write because you're like, this is where Sally shines, this is Shally's bread and butter, how do I get this into a chapter that is the same size as everything else, or was it this is the one that flowed kind of easy because you knew what it was there?
Oh, good question. I think the start of that chapter, my main focus was helping people. So I wasn't wanting to dismiss the desire for growth that people have. Like, that is valid and good. Like, if there is some good news that we have in our experience of the God who comes to us in Jesus, well, you would want to share that. In the same way, if you went to a fantastic restaurant and tasted food, you want to tell your friends, I'm not equating the two, but it not out of guilt, not out of colonizing or anything like that. If there is something tasty that is good about this way of Jesus, we naturally would want to share it and put it go. But I love the imagery of a womb, though, because for people who have experienced having a baby or who've lost a baby or journeyed with someone who has, they know that it's a really not a guaranteed thing. It's a very vulnerable thing. And so it is growth, but it's often out of our control. It's hidden. And, it talks about, the Spirit's work, the growing happens in the night, for example, of the field and so on. So I love that sense about reclaiming notions of growth out of prosperity gospel, but also out of the consumerist, do a program, let's rate the numbers, let's guarantee the next level, all of that kind of notion of growth as empire shaped and consumer shaped, to a different model of growth, which is really cool, that it's mysterious, it's wondrous, we're not sure how it's going to happen, and we can't control very much of it. So that was the beginning of that. And then when it came to the section about wanting to explore, or just to introduce people to a little taste of early church understandings of Jesus as the female divine, it was more about how much to include and how, wanting to give people enough of a taste they can go and do more, but not wanting to do a huge academic kind of.
Yes.
So I'm in the middle of the book, because my other goal with this book was to absolutely wrestle with the biblical texts and early church writers, but to do it in an accessible way, so that if people have never done that kind of deeper reading, that they weren't going to be alienated on page 3. So I wanted it to be a friendly book, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Which it certainly is. But I do think that is so helpful, because I think, that growth, I think you're right. Like there is reasons to want it to we think it's a good thing to increase in a way that is invitational and that, but also, yes, that acknowledging that fragility, and not knowing what happens, and even thinking about that once someone is born and raised, you have diminishing levels of influence and control on the person they are, and similarly, if you do lead someone, you're somewhat influential and bring someone into a Christian community, into some sort of relationship with Jesus, and then it's like, well, then it has to be theirs, right? Like, you think of the woman who Jesus meets at the well, and she goes off and tells everyone, hey, like this pretty incredible thing just happened. Like maybe this guy's a kind of a big deal. And everyone comes and like, Jesus, come and hang out. And then they all come to her and like, yeah, we dig it. We dig it too. Not because of you anymore, but this, which is, she did still play a part, but there is this sense of, but it does, you are eventually, you're drawn into your own relationship, and she's not going to be able to sway that, really, control what they become any more than my mum and dad can, tell me what to do, but they can't tell me what to do anymore.
Exactly. And that notion that it's that it is organic and it's ongoing, and that we are not in control of it. I think that's so important for us to really, there's gift in that, because people can go, phew, we're not in control. But also like a real challenge to ego about those who are, really, it's very seductive to go down the church growth, whichever model is in favor. It's, seductive stuff. But I think it's a really dangerous, not always, but it can be a really dangerous way of schlupping back into thinking of the church as important. And I therefore have an important role in that. And I think that, look, part of this book is like, it is like, I do challenge myself and other leaders in that, because part of, I think, the grief in our current context is that because the church was seen as important, clergy was seen as important, and that's not the case anymore. And I say praise be to God. Like, Jesus did not want to set up a team of important people going out. He said, take nothing with you, go and be vulnerable in community, and if people don't want to hear what you have to say, move on. Don't carry that resentment, shake it off and move on. But it's much more vulnerable, so
that's very true. So maybe as we land the plane, I'm just curious to think about how, how we talked about how the book has, is broken up in a way that, pardon me, very accessible, short chapters with built-in questions. It's also got the art, which is incredible throughout the chapters. What are your thoughts, or or encouragement on how either individuals or communities might engage this work, and any thoughts you've had as you were putting it together, or in the small amount of time that it's been out in the world?
Great question. So I wrote it intentionally thinking that it could be used either for individuals or with faith communities together as a study book. So each chapter ends with reflection questions and then a liturgy, and inviting people, and a liturgy that can be used on your own or with others. And at Richmond, we regularly read books together as a community and meet a couple of times to discuss them, and they've been quite transformative over the years. We've read all kinds of books, and so maybe that practice has helped me. And I think also it shifts that, like a lot of people, I talk about this in the book, our culture is so different from what people maybe recall from even 20 years ago, when people met regularly for weekly cell groups, small groups, Bible study groups. And I know they still work in some contexts, but in a lot of contexts they don't anymore. People are really time poor, or coming and going and so on. So having a discrete 6 or 7 weeks, or if you did 2 chapters, it be 3 weeks or so. I think it's a bit more sustainable for people. So I think using it in that way, and the reflection questions are open questions, not closed questions. Like, tell me, what did Jocelyn say here? It's like, what is this speaking to you, and what is this challenging you to think about more? Is kind of the sense of the questions. The artwork, just a shout out to the artist Pearl Taylor, the Melbourne artist, and she sat with the manuscript and made artwork. They're actually it's paper cut. It's incredibly fine. So you can if she holds them, you can see through the images for each chapter, and they're astonishing in their own right. And I think can be part of they could be part of a prayer practice, staying with each of those images, really. So that's how, and I think also it's probably a book, even though it's, and I intentionally made it not too long, but it's quite dense. And so it's a book that I suspect people will go back to, because I like it, particularly in the first chapter, like if you can imagine a line of sacred cows. No, I don't eat beef, but being kind of shot off, that kind of a whole lot of idols just get knocked off. But I hope in a way that helps people then to begin to go back to the question of what are we here for, and how can we be faithful? No, I
agree. I think it would work very well like that, and yes, is definitely revisitable, and you would work, and just pretty much again, because it's not you saying this is how I transform Richmond United Church, and you can too. And those books are always like the person just happened to lightning in a bottle and the spirit and something. Exactly. It's just, here's an open, invitational way of unlearning and learning that maybe can then help shape how you think about being faithful more than anything else in this time as this community. So it's definitely I highly commend it.
Yeah, thank you. And just to, before I was at Richmond, before I did my doctoral research, I was a minister in a rural setting with 6 little congregations, and so they're in the background as well. So it's not kind of city centric either. No,
I think I did I really appreciated it's such a relief when someone just actually acknowledges people just don't have time, that time boy aspect, because I've done working with a congregation which was in kind of a regional setting, which was a commuter town. So a lot of people who lived around the church were spending about 20 hours a week, I'd say, commuting back and forth from work. Right?
Totally.
It's a long thing. So you can't even start something at 7. 7's touch and go for someone to make it back from work to an event.
Correct.
If they can, they're probably skipping dinner or skipping out on, seeing family or what have you, or just resting. And so you think, what are you putting on that? How are you doing things that connect with people through the week, if that's what you want to be doing? Is such a conundrum and a question. I think this tackles that and helps reshape some of those fears and apprehensions over here in thinking about how we might do it again, or how we think anew. Yeah,
absolutely. Because I think embroiled in that, there's a whole set of assumptions, and some of them I think are really unhelpful. That we've all been slopped up into, that the notion that if people can only make it to Sunday worship, somehow they're not committed. It's well, Justin only thinks they can gather then. Let's reevaluate this assumption, because embedded in that assumption, I think often, maybe not explicitly acknowledged, is the notion that people aren't at mission when they're teaching or nursing or working at the supermarket or farming. It's still I don't know, I think it's still pretty empire-driven notion that the church is at mission when the church does stuff, rather than commissioning people out and blessing them as they go out in mission in their everyday lives. I think that's part of the issue around time as well.
No, thank you for that. Well, folks, the book is The Church Triumph, The Church as Salt. That's my best ability to bring
I love it. That's a perfect way of putting
it. Becoming the Community Jesus Speaks About, out with Coventry Press. Definitely worth picking up. Good accessible price, great accessible book. Please do check that out. Sally, is there anything else you want to draw folks' attention to or promote at this moment?
No, people, I'm so embarrassed. I've got a website. If people want to see more of my writing and speaking and so on, they'll find me online. Yeah.
I'll put the website in the show notes.
Okay,
People can go to that. There's some great pieces on that I've read and used. So, Sally, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll speak to you again sometime sooner rather than later. And
that'd be awesome, Liam.
Folks,
thanks for all your work.
Thank you, and folks, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.